It's February, and I think there's a lot of love going around. And you know what? I think a lot of people love bourbon these days. So it's fitting that we're talking to this guy, as he's, I think, connected to a lot of it with the company that he co-founded. And it's another fun one that we've got. We've got questions for Beau Beckman, co-founder of Hogshead. Beau, welcome in.
No, thank you. Appreciate having me here.
Yeah.
Nice to be
Well,
doing one of these again.
I was going to say, I think what we're going to talk about is I think you have a love of the industry, and people can find a lot of different things with the company that you founded. But before we jump into all that fun stuff on what you're working on now, the spirits world is a crazy place to be in and get into. So how did you end up in the spirits business and all of that?
Yeah, I got very lucky for one. That would be the main thing. I was born, and that helped. And then, fast forward through college, I was working my first job after college, and this is right around that Great Recession in 2008. The housing market collapsed, and so like I'm fresh out of college, and it was like, oh, what do we do here? And so I ended up working with car dealerships, and I sold cars in college. And essentially, it was more on the software side of things. It was about the time that car dealerships were getting pushed to put their inventory online. It was, when I was in college selling cars, we'd get a lot of these people calling in, and the whole thing was get them on the lot, get them on the lot. And it was like, okay. But after college, we're building these websites for the dealerships, and then also once we get leads to the dealerships, we manage their sales process. But a lot of it was, convincing these dealerships you need to get your inventory and price it online because that's how people are shopping now. Like the world is changing, and so a lot of it they're like, well, we don't want to show our prices because they negotiate prices. And so I did that for a few years, and then my grandma was actually, this is bizarre, she was working with the University of Kentucky and Buffalo Trace Distillery at the time to record the oral history project for Buffalo Trace. And so, Elmer, Freddie, Mark Brown, just a lot of like the core crew was being interviewed. And along those times, Sazerac was reacquiring the old Taylor brand. And just trying to put it back in its rightful place at Buffalo Trace where he, built that distillery. So it was the convenient convergence of circumstances was that my grandma, who was married to my grandfather, it was E.H. Taylor Hay Jr., told the marketing department who she was working with that her grandson is working, in Louisville, has a marketing degree, does stuff helping car dealerships get their inventory online, whatnot. And so there happened about that time to be posting a job for the personalized barrel manager role. And, I had no understanding of really 3-tier distribution. I knew of Old Taylor and my connections to that, but I didn't really know his actual like impact or presence. I just knew him as that guy on the bottle that my family was related to. That was kind of not much more than that. And so, yeah, I got an interview with the marketing department, and on my resume, I was sure to put the Taylor in the middle of it. Hopefully, I would get a call back. And I did get a call back, and then I interviewed with my boss at the time was Chris Comstock, and he basically, who ended up hiring me, and that was how I got my foot in the door.
I love that, and you grew then. You've been around the business ever since, and like I said, Hogshead. We'll talk a little bit about what it does, but you mentioned you got the job with Sazerac doing their single barrel select program. What was that like for you? Because I'm guessing that was where, like you said, you didn't have a ton of background knowledge on kind of how the whole industry worked. I'm guessing you got a crash course, and that's where everything kind of took off for you.
Yes, that's exactly what happened. I did get a crash course, and honestly, I loved it that way. When I was selling cars, there's Saturdays where you had like 8 customers and you're running around trying to help everybody. And you'd look up and like the day was over and you're like, oh, well, what happened? And that was basically every single day at Buffalo Trace when I started. It was just a different time. At that time, people weren't buying barrels. There was, again, like the early adopters were buying. There were some retailers around the country. Some of like the earliest barrel groups were buying that were kind of like the core ones that have been there. I refer to those folks as the top of the waterfall. Like, we can come back to that. I go down a lot of rabbit holes. I'm sorry.
Hey, nothing wrong with that at all.
Yeah, and so my boss sat me down and he said, "Look, here's your job." He was in charge of basically, he was more of like the general manager of the distillery of sorts, but his official role was marketing for all of the bourbons. And Buffalo Trace was his baby. He kept that very close to his heart. And so I was actually hired by Sazerac, and my employer was Sazerac, but I worked out of Buffalo Trace. And so, he said, we need to grow the barrel program, sell more barrels, and we need to make more raving fans in the distillery. And that's about it. We need someone to be an expert of this. Right now, it's very disjointed. And have at it. And so, like, he didn't really, like, micromanage me or anything like that. He basically just said, this is the outcomes we need to do, and go for it. And then along the way, very helpful in coaching and all that stuff. But the first thing I realized was, you've got a distillery, and a lot of people, like, they kind of get lost in the romance of it. But at the core of it, those are manufacturing facilities. So it's like you're walking in to where your shampoo is made and asking everybody all these questions. And like, it's like there is a big time operation there. And at these distilleries, you've got this nucleus of a process, which is the warehouse. Everything starts and basically kind of, in some way respects ends with the warehouse. And then you've got the lab, and then you've got the distribution center, and then you've got bottling, and then you've got sales, and you got marketing, and everyone's all over. Some people, like distilleries are big places too, so, the big ones. And so it's these very siloed processes, and the barrel program, single barrel programs specifically, go directly against the grain of standard operating procedures for distilleries and for distributors. It's hard work for them. The way I like often would, this is it's oversimplification, but if you can imagine a field of corn, like historically the natural process for harvesting that field of corn is you're going to get a big turbine and go through the field and harvest a lot at a time. And the way those warehouses are built and the ricks are giant Pez dispensers, like, you're supposed to get the barrels all in and all out at the same time. And so, like, imagine if you're on the turbine going through the field and some noob rookie comes out of nowhere telling you, like, don't hit that piece of corn because I've got a customer in California that wants to taste it, this one kernel. And then we're going to run it through the manufacturing process and the 3-tier system and make sure that kernel gets to their outlet. Everyone's like, that sounds great. And so the reality is, and sorry if I'm talking too much, please jump in.
No, because it is, I mean, that is kind of, people may not think about it like that, but it really, it goes counterintuitive to what a lot nowadays it's very normal, but back then that was a whole different thought process of, hey, let's put this aside and you can have all the rest.
Yeah. And like one of, I think the most like, I didn't really recognize it at the time really until I started this company now. It's like the number one priority for my job at all times, regardless of what was going on, was world-class customer service. And and so I started like, well, that's normal. Like, I'm out of college. Like, you got to have customer service. If they get your McDonald's orders wrong, you're gonna be so mad they got to fix it. Like customer service. And I didn't really kind of like. I delivered. I tried my best to deliver on that. I definitely took it seriously, but I didn't really understand at the time that that was different than a lot of other facilities. Whereas they, I think this is 2011, and I don't want to speak for other distilleries, but this was my anecdotal view from where I was it seemed like I would get a lot of calls from consumers or retailers that would say, I want to buy a barrel. I've called other distilleries. They told me to go call a retailer or go do something, like go somewhere else because they're the distillery. And in our world, it was like, great, you want to come visit us and see how we make things, and you even want to buy 200 bottles of it? Like, that's amazing. Please come visit. And at the time, these were hard to sell. Like, people would turn their nose up and say, I don't want to buy a barrel of rock gut whiskey. And, everybody that came into Kentucky would say, oh, you guys marry your cousins and don't wear shoes. Like, it was fascinating to watch those two dynamics change so quickly in like 3 or 4 years. We didn't have enough bourbon. We weren't even close to having enough bourbon. And all of a sudden people like thought Louisville was really cool and Kentucky was really like fancy and romantic. And it's like, oh, yeah, you get it. I've always thought that way.
And like you said, it's fascinating too to see how things have evolved, because nowadays it's very common for almost any size distillery to have some type of, barrel select program or something like that. But back then it wasn't, and now too, as it's more things come online. There's more barrels out there, and trying to piece together how you might be able to get your hands on those, whether you're a producing distillery that wants to, have some extra stock, or even, a non-distilling producer that's looking for things. And that's, I'm guessing, where the next step led for you when you left and launched Hogshead. Is that where this idea came about?
Somewhat. It was just a lot of kind of where I thought the industry was headed. When bourbon collapsed in the 70s and 80s, software and systems were growing. And just the way that you have to build a bourbon distillery, the capital outlay is immense. And when you do overproduce, the cost of inventory is going up while the amount of inventory is going down. And everything basically kind of like breaks pretty easily at this point. And so all that is to say, by the time I started in 2011, there was, I think there was technically like 100 or something American whiskey distillers in the United States, but there was the big ones that everybody knew of, and Buffalo Trace was not one of them. Like, none of my friends, I went to Kentucky, none of my friends knew what Buffalo Trace was. They didn't understand it. I didn't until, yeah, now they do. It's so frustrating sometimes. Like, even my family, like 2 years after I left, some like are starting to, like, imagine the people getting in on that wave that I talked about. Like, I'm like, now you stand up. Been waiting for you. But yeah, so I got distracted there. I think I was headed somewhere where
Well, just seeing where people have the inventory, and like I think you were saying, as costs go up, it's
yeah.
not time is money, and also it's not a cheap one to launch anything either these days.
No, not at all. And so, yeah, essentially where I was headed that with, by the time I started in 2011 and I'm wanting to be that guy that goes to the field and grab one barrel of corn, it's like, there hasn't been a lot of investment in software and, just foundational things that you would really want to have if you're managing barrels on an individual level. Historically, the government, what they really care about in terms of warehouse inventory is how many proof gallons are in your warehouse, not what barrels are in there and, what is the individual barrel numbers. My family comes from, my dad is a horse vet, and my brother's a horse trainer, and my sister actually runs their businesses. And I'm always fascinated because every horse has an individual ID. And when they move it from barn to barn, a horse can't go from one barn to another without a Coggins report, which is like a picture of the horse, information about its blood type, like everything you would need about that horse. And it's like when barrels move from warehouse to warehouse, not necessarily within a distillery, but outside a distillery, it's like, what's going on here? you know, and then, so again, 2010, 2011, not a lot of, you know, when I say like Sazerac was different because Mark Brown, the CEO, is a different breed and makes his own systems and has like, he knows what he was doing in that regard. And again, can't speak for other people, but there wasn't software that everybody in the industry could share and use that was focused for the industry. And so, you know, from 2011 to when I left Sazerac in 2022, there were, I think, 2,000 plus new, you know, DSPs in America. And, you know, most of them were using a system called Whiskey Systems, which was great for these craft distilleries. But at the same time, the system is only as good as the data you put in. And so when I'm at Buffalo Trace and Sazerac over those 10 years or 12 years, whatever it was, you know, I was working with a bunch of different distilleries. We would acquire new distilleries at the time. And there's just a general challenge of everyone is not speaking the same language. You know, if I go to Carvana.com or whatever you want to call any of those car sites, they all have the data structured, fuel type, make, model. As complicated as you want to get, they've got it structured there. And so fast forward to when I'm leaving Sazerac, a lot of the trends I saw from consumers, when we talked about the people at the top of the waterfall, as in like, you know, this is a really weird analogy and I'm going off the rails here, so feel free to bring me out. There's an artist, Banksy, and he's really famous by name. No one's really ever seen him, I guess, and he does these documentaries and these other things that you don't see his face. And there's one thing I was always fascinated by because I felt like this happened to me at Buffalo Trace, which was he was on the street painting and doing his own painting. He looked like just a homeless person doing art. And everybody would just walk by him not caring. Now, if he had a big sign in front of him that said Banksy, they'd be stopping and grabbing his stuff. But there's no sign there. Just he's doing it by himself. Then every now and then someone would stop that appreciates the art, look at it, and then buy a piece for like $10. And that was a great value to them. And that person is likely someone that appreciates art as a rare art collector, you know, is someone that is like really into it. So they're going to go home and they're going to hang that piece up, and then their friends are going to come over and they're going to say, oh, what is, you know, that's cool. Who is that? And he's going to say, oh, it was on the streets, this guy named Banksy. So now all those friends are looking for Banksy. They're not looking for that art. They're looking for Banksy. And like in the beginning, it was really fun at Buffalo Trace because I was calling people that had no expectations and didn't want anything we had to sell. They would begrudgingly show up to the distillery, and then like if you've been to Buffalo Trace, like it's amazing. You can like, especially in the early days, there was nobody really there. Like I mean, it was like 15,000 visitors a year or something, you know, and you would just get these like you'd spend a day with Freddie, eat lunch, you know, and drink, you know, sample your barrel, and then get it delivered, and it was $10 or, you know, $30 a bottle by the time you got it at the retail. So that's a tremendous amount of value. But the people that were there early were the people that were dedicated enough to be reaching out to a distillery and getting in touch with like a random person and having getting connected to the personalized barrel. Like eventually you get to who you need to, and they're like, yeah, like I want to come pick my own barrel. Like it was a crazy proposition at the time. Like you had to be very like an enthusiast of sorts. And so they came in, and I think they really, that's the top of the waterfall. The people that like appreciate the art at the value. And over the time, just because of, you know, fans and demand can grow a heck of a lot faster than supply with whiskey. So very quickly, the people that liked Buffalo Trace because of the whiskey turned into people that like the brand Weller, turned into, I like Weller, I like Taylor, I like Iguera, I like Buffalo Trace, I like Pappy, I like they're all like hunting the brands, whereas the other people were at like after the whiskey, if that makes sense. And so I think there's a general trend from a consumers of like, I think there needs to be a return of value. Like the value proposition has been lost, and that is what got the growth there to begin with. And I see a lot of that occurring mostly in the new world I'm in, which is the contract production, non-distilling producers, which is what Hogshead kind of touches into. So really, Hogshead, I'm trying to, and like I probably try to do too much. At the simple basics of it, it's a marketplace for buyers and sellers. So it's eBay.
But see, that
And
doesn't sound as much fun as what you just described.
yeah, I know. I can get so I'm dyslexic as all get out, and I start at the end, and then I have to like back in to the beginning. And so, especially in these conversations, like I'll just get lost and like this is the vision, this is where we're headed. At like step one. Step one is basically trying to standardize the language and the documentation and the processes of buying and selling bulk whiskey, which I kind of just jumped into why we're doing that. I didn't really explain that there's a lake of whiskey out there right now. And essentially, if you do that and make it frictionless enough, you can reduce the order quantities and kind of remove how the sausage is made for a whole segment of people that are left out right now. Which is, I think, again, if you are someone that just really cares about good whiskey at a value and you're sick of like hunting allocations and chasing like brand names, then you just like want to find the whiskey on your own and don't really care as much about the packaging or want to do your own packaging. Like there's, I think, a lot more people that want to do that than people understand. But like I was saying earlier, that goes against the grain. That is not ideal. And so what I built at Sazerac in Buffalo Trace was this website called singlebarrelselect.com, and it made it to where any distillery and any department within that distillery could log in, and it would manage their activity and their handoffs and show them what needed to be done next on the back end. And on the front end, it made it easier for anybody that wanted to buy a barrel. I didn't care if it was a consumer, a retailer, a distributor, or a Sazerac salesperson. If you wanted to order a barrel, regardless of what distillery it comes from, you would go to this one website, singlebarrelselect.com. And really the growth of Single Barrel Select came more through like optimization of processes and speeding up turnaround and, reducing input and maximizing output. It just like, and so this kind of brings me back to the current world. There's a lot of parallels between that single barrel world and now the bulk world. In the bulk world, you have segmented barrel owners out there. And when I'm in this world, I'm not really referring to the big distilleries that we're talking about. Just think of it more of just like, let's say investment groups that bought barrels as a commodity. They're segmented all over. The people don't really understand the language of them. They don't have an exit ramp for them. There are no brands attached to them. So I'm down a rabbit hole again. I forget how I got here.
Well, I mean, but for those that are wondering how Hogshead does work, I think that's where you were headed because
Yeah.
like you said, it's a marketplace, and I've talked to NDPs, and sometimes they're just calling up different people, and you really have no clue what they really have. You're going off of a hope that they're telling you something correct, and I'm guessing that's where Hogshead kind of comes in to allow some of those others to maybe
Yes.
actually know what they're getting their hands on.
Thank you. Yes. So the reality or like the way I look at it is that the non-distilling producer is taking the most risk here in terms of they're converting that barrel into bottles. And if they don't sell through, they're not going to continue to do that. And what happened during the bourbon boom was their cost basis on barrels got absurd. If you're a new plant and you want to be a big tree someday, you just have to start small, regardless of what you want to do. And it got to the point where bourbon turned into like liquid gold, and there was a gold rush of speculators. And so what the speculators would do is get out in front of the buyers that wanted 5 barrels, and they'd buy 1,000 barrels, and they'd age them for 4 years until you could call them Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey. And then they'd sell them for way too much, because at that same time, places like the, again, Buffalo Trace, I'm sure Heaven Hill, Wild Turkey, whoever, Willet, they're turning down sales all around America because they don't have enough product. So those same people that are getting turned down on sales on bourbon were looking to replace shelf space. And so on one end, there's so much pull-in from distributors and retailers that just want to fill shelf space with bourbon, not necessarily like brand equity that exists there to get that shelf space. And then on the back end, you have these people that are trying to get brands stood up, and because of the way the bulk infrastructure was, they like would have to get a loan and basically, lose ownership of their brand to even buy barrels and get them bottled. Or they'd have to, because the MOQs, the minimum order quantities, were way too high for them. And at the same time, they can't even get like a discerning selection of samples to pick from the barrels that they're having to buy. So it's like they're kind of forced to buy barrels they don't necessarily need to buy all of. They can't really get good sampling and selection on those barrels. And then it puts them in a bad position financially. And all of that rolls over to $80 bottles of 4-year-old whiskey on the shelf that you don't know anything about them. And it's like, and so essentially, if you can reduce the friction enough for the sellers to where, because I haven't said this, to sell a barrel is a lot of work. So 1 barrel versus 100 barrels, it's the same exact paperwork and process. So they'd rather sell 100. If you're the broker, like the warehouse has to move 100 more barrels, but if you're the broker or the admin, like it's the same paperwork. So if we can automate a lot of those handoffs and remove a lot of that admin burden, which is done by like simple things. Instead of a text input, it's a drop down. Like, this information is required here, so by the time you get here, we know it. It's just, I'm sure everybody in their own industry has email chains that just convoluted with information. Well, then eventually these get copy pasted into a, inventory system, and we're talking like millions of dollars of barrel inventory. And it's just kind of, it's a bit of a hot mess on the back end. And that's like, again, what like a lot of people don't understand is the distilleries aren't focused on this process necessarily. Like they've got their own stuff going on. And so all of a sudden this activity lands in their lap, but doesn't really come in any sort of like sound structure. It's a lot of figuring out, reading the email. What's this person want to do? What are they, what's going on here? And so, marketplace is kind of an oversimplification of it's like in the barrel program. I could have at Sazerac, we could have just made the front end ordering system, but nothing would have happened to help the back end velocity. You can sell 5 barrels a year versus 1 if you do it 5 times faster. And so a lot of the tool, the way I kind of think about it is step 1 was more about, like if you go back to the eBay analogy, eBay was a spot, online marketplace for buyers and sellers to meet and work together. So it's just a platform. They don't own the inventory. They're just the middle guy. So that's Hogshead. We're just the middle guy. We don't have any ownership in inventory. We're simply just connective tissue trying to make the process more sound, structured, manageable. And so when you think of eBay existed a little while, and then PayPal came out. And once PayPal came out, it was a real game changer, because now I don't have to, offline worry about writing checks and doing all these like payment things, whatever. Like there's a quick payment tool here. And so on our Hogshead team, it's, the other co-founders, it's tech team. And so that we're all software and focused on software and just optimizing in making solutions that really just make this whole process easier. And so right now we've aggregated a lot of the inventory, and then our focus is on basically structuring that inventory and giving the incentives to the non-distilling producer. So now if you're a non-distilling producer and you're reaching out to maybe who was is your broker, or the only person you know is your contact, asking for 7-year MGP or 7-year Bardstown bourbon, they might say, yeah, here's your price. Well, now in Hogshead, you can go filter 7-year Bardstown bourbon, and here are 4 different listings, different order quantities, different pricing, and you can make 4 different offers for free at whatever quantity and price suits you. And maybe somebody accepts, maybe nobody accepts, they counter, you work it out. That's all free. You don't have to pay for any of that. The only time you pay money is if you buy barrels, then there's a transaction fee. And so the idea there is basically just to, by kind of giving the NDP more options, and then, when you put those listings next to each other, it's natural for the sellers to get more competitive.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I feel like too, it can also eliminate. Sometimes you might be talking to 2 brokers, and they might have they might each say they have MGP. You think it's 2 different things. They're both just beating them. They're pricing each other out and so forth. So it kind of can give those guys a little extra fighting chance. And as you've launched this and it's gotten up online, what's one of those maybe things you've learned or surprised you most since you guys launched this and brought it to the bourbon world?
I don't know if it's necessarily a surprise or not, but samples is definitely one thing that doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. So in my old world, if you wanted to buy 1 barrel, you would have a choice of 3 samples or 3 barrels to pick from. Well, I think it's important to understand how much work actually goes into getting a sample out of a barrel. Like it involves a person with a drill, a bottle. They shuffle in between the ricks, find your barrel in that line of Pez dispenser stuff, drill it, fill the bottle, tap it. You got to take it to the lab, do your government. You got to take the proof, register it, tell the government how much you pulled out, and then you got to shipping alcohol through FedEx or something to the customer, and then don't touch that barrel while we're doing that. It's an ordeal, and so people don't like to do it. That's just the reality. Like in the beginning, when I was hand selling barrels, like begging people to buy barrels at Buffalo Trace, like there was definitely, we had to sample more. That was the reality of it. And then once the dynamic shifted to where we didn't have enough barrels, people say, well, I don't need to sample, just let me go. Like, I'll pick one for me. We don't even have to sample. I know they're good. I know you guys do a great job of picking it. Well, so now in this current world, we have like what I think is a ecosystem of a lot of NDPs that want to be buying in smaller quantities and things they can afford, and having samples. Like there are sellers that are, I'm not saying they're freaking out, but it's like there's a lot of whiskey sitting out there, and if you want to sell it, you're going to have to come down on your order quantity, and you're going to have samples ready. It's not a super complicated thing, but there's a perk in this for the investors, because when you come down on your order quantity, you can also go up on your price per barrel. So if you're selling 1,000 barrels and your price is $3,000 per barrel for 1,000 barrels, well, one of those might sell for $5,000. Because it's a whole different, the 1 barrel buyer is going to bottles, and that cost base of $5,000 on like a 7-year barrel is still really good in the format of, I just want to get this into bottles as cheap as possible. Not really, like basically our next iteration is adding the bottling outlets, just so you can source your whiskey on here, you can resell it on here, So how are you going to get it bottled? So not again, we don't want to own bottling. We just want to give you those, aggregate the resources for you. Um, so like the investors that right now, if you've got barrels sitting at say, there are third party storage facilities that are simply built in Kentucky to hold barrels for investors. Well, one thing I don't think is going to go away with bourbon is this romance factor of visiting Kentucky and I never had a barrel customer. So like I was friends with a lot of our barrel customers in the beginning because like I was hand selling these things and they would come in and every single one would come back the next summer. And then eventually I was like, hey, we don't have any more barrels to sell. I have to limit you to what you've already got. And now everybody coming in is coming in so hot, like I can't really make new friends anymore in terms of like it's impossible to onboard this madness. Um, but like what I'm saying is that just whenever I have, in my experience, that like experience of having a tasting in Kentucky and then getting the material value of the bottles and like saying I picked that barrel, there's a whole attachment experience. Whether you're a dentist in Colorado giving it away as gifts, it's for your daughter's wedding, corporate gifting. There's a billion different reasons that people want to do these types of things. Hops and Spirits wants to do their own bottling, like all of those types of things. Restaurants, retailers, there's plenty of it, and if you can just remove the friction from it, it's good. And so, sorry, all of a sudden now these investors that don't have exit ramps where the barrels are just being stored with nothing to do, they can offer barrel tastings, and these investors are basically getting dividends on their barrels while they're waiting for a larger deal. And so, go ahead.
I was gonna say that makes sense. That you're, like you said, you're giving more options to not just one person, but really kind of multiple people, so that they can keep their investments going.
Yeah, well, because that's what I think. Like the investors do play a very critical role for non-distilling producers. As in, if I want to have a 6-year brand, it's really hard to sit on 6 years of inventory and grow that brand at the same time. And historically, it was risky not to acquire the inventory when it was available to you, especially with bourbon over the last 10 years. So it's just like, well, crap, this might not be available again. And so, and based on my experience of like with being involved with new brands on the whiskey side, you don't start a new brand with 500 barrels for the first run, even at a big place. Like you got to start small. And so hopefully Hogshead can give everybody that fertile ground to like be one, make it easy to buy and sell barrels. And then after you make it easy, like the way I think about it is barrels right now are being traded like as commodities instead of assets. It can do both. So, people have unopened packs of baseball cards and are just trading the unopened packs. So I think there's a way to let in the next segment of, again, the people that care about the whiskey are the people at the top of the waterfall that made Banksy who Banksy is. Back to that thing. Like if you let them in and they start tasting through your inventory, and your inventory is now aggregated and standardized to where they can say like, oh, this 2016 first year run of BBC is like, that's what the barrel picks are at. So it's almost like being able to vintage date whiskey of the sorts. So I'm all over the map. That's what I'm not trying to confuse the crap out of your audience. It's a marketplace to buy and sell barrels of bulk whiskey.
But like you said, it goes deeper than that, and that's its core. But as it builds upon stuff and makes it a lot easier for folks to talk amongst one another, talk to an NDP, to a producer or an investment group or whoever has the barrels, and hopefully we'll see a lot less friction, maybe a few more bottles at a little bit lower price with some good stuff that we actually know about. And Beau, it seems like you guys got an interesting thing going at a interesting time in the marketplace. And as Hogshead grows, obviously I know you guys are still early in the whole process, really and the big picture of how long whiskey and, and bourbon's been around. But what's kind of the ultimate goal? What's next for y'all as you kind of continue to build?
Yeah, so the primary focus is the marketplace. It's just in general, the bourbon market is slow right now, so it's not, in some respects, it's not optimal to be a startup in the marketplace world right now. But at the same time, I remember I was getting my real estate license, and this was 2008, and they said this is time to get it. When it's down, that's when you can grow with the market, and then you're there when it's back up. Um, and so the primary focus is on the marketplace, and right now it's just an American whiskey marketplace. I think you'll see tequila and Scotch, maybe Irish whiskey, Canadian whiskey. Those will probably be coming. Um, then what I'm most excited about is tying in the barrels to bottles, because that's my old world. That's what I know how to do best. It's just in my old world, I was very focused on wanting to maintain provenance from the barrel all the way to a potential bottle that might wind up in an auction in 50 years. And I think if you have this world where, if you think of Scotch, you see a lot of independent bottlings, but if there's independent bottlings that all have this like back end ecosystem where the data is and the provenance lies, like, I think that's the big picture over time where we want to be, is like that, that's just a wealth of information and utility there for industry. If you're going to start a new brand and you're a big company, the way they'd have to do it in the past is you're reaching out to distilleries all over the world to see if they have inventory on a certain type of spirit. And then you're like having them mail samples to you. It's a really long, arduous process. And even on the creative side too, you're reaching out to creative agencies to get them to mock up things. And our software engineer, I sit next to him, and yesterday he was just having a moment, and I'm asking him what's up. He's like, I just did something in 1 minute that 5 years ago took me 1 month at 40 hours a week. And it's just like, they can build so fast now. It's just really fun to kind of like see what all we can do with this.
Well, and your adage to the trading card, sports cards, things like that. It's much nicer to know what you truly have when you're buying it and it's been graded and so forth. And it seems like Hogshead is maybe making it a little more comfortable for people to buy barrels and source barrels and things like that. And Beau, I appreciate the time, the background, and just kind of the thought process that went into Hogshead.
Well, thank you for having me on. Sorry for, blabbing a little bit and getting lost sometimes. Comes with me. Sorry. I really
Hey, all
enjoyed
good.